Pack your bags, kids, we're off to war. MPs have voted for British airstrikes on Syria with a comfortable majority, but opinion within the general population is divided. Pro-interventionists argue that we need to act and that bombing ISIS is necessary following the events in Paris, as the UK could be the next target. Meanwhile, anti-war supporters argue that conflict would solve nothing, and we would be figuratively and literally adding fuel to the fire, just like in Iraq, Afghanistan and Libya. So as the planes are taking off, will bombing Syria make us any safer? Or will it create more instability, anger and displacement for many more innocent people? The Russians, Americans, Iranians, the Turks, the French, even the Syrians themselves are all already bombing in Syria. What are British bombs going to do that foreign ones couldn't? So why are we getting involved in Syria? We're told that it's 100% about ISIS. Cameron has been hell-bent on a mission to bomb Syria. Before this victory, he saw airstrikes in 2013, but lost the vote. After Paris though, the tide of approval shifted. ISIS represents the biggest threat to the Western world. We must retaliate, right? Well, fundamentally, retaliation is exactly what ISIS wants. Nicholas Enan, who was held hostage by ISIS for 10 months, states that ISIS craves nothing more than to provoke retaliation and wants us to fight them so we vilify Islam, and in turn alienating the 1.5 billion Muslims from the rest of the world.
At the moment, with the bombings, we are more like pushing the people into the hands of ISIS. We are just fueling our enemies and fueling the misery, the disaster for the local people. Strikes on ISIS are a trap.
Effectively, they want us to do their recruitment for them. What better way is to get them to join ISIS? On top of this, airstrikes in previous wars like Iraq or Libya haven't proved too successful, have they? We flattened Iraq, contributing to widespread radicalization, a big part of the reason why we're in this mess, and now we're going to do it again? Leading figures such as former US head of intelligence Michael Flynn states that airstrikes would actually be highly ineffectual. Whilst NATO General Sir Richard Sheriff echoes these statements, he also adds that airstrikes would just further pull us into a long and bloody war. But the barbaric nature of the medieval society they impose has no place in the 21st century. Well, yes, but what about Saudi Arabia? Whilst the world was horrified by journalist James Foley's beheading by ISIS, Saudi Arabia has set a 20-year high of 151 beheadings for this year alone. Speaking out against the government, homosexuality, or even leaving the Islamic faith are punishable by death. Sounds familiar? So it seems you're a barbaric death cult if you oppose the West, but a friend and ally if you're the biggest customer of UK arms sales. Speaking of, one of the things they don't tell you in school textbooks is war is a very profitable business. Whilst we're on the subject, countries like Saudi Arabia contribute to 1.6 billion of our military exports, and there are now 200 joint business ventures between the UK and Saudi Arabia worth 17.5 billion. It all becomes very clear when you see that following the Paris attacks, the stocks of the world's biggest weapons manufacturers skyrocketed. Look at just how immediately the stocks flew up. The market could not wait to capitalise on the conflict and the resulting trade that would follow a Syrian war. Now that Britain is involved in Syria, you can bet someone's making a killing. Pun intended. The president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, has become a bit of a forgotten figure in this conflict, despite his best efforts, which mainly comes in the form of chemical warfare and barrel bombs. Assad's headlines are constantly being taken by ISIS. That's not to say that the Western powers are done with him though. The Western coalition is very much looking to dispose of him along with the Islamic State. And why would they do that? Well, it seems like natural resources. Funny that. It's always fucking natural resources. Reports suggest that the unexplored offshore Syrian region is full to the brim with natural gas, which has left our governments foaming at the mouth of possibility. The removal of all current parties in Syria would allow a puppet-like regime to be put in place, allowing them to vacuum up all of that gas for maximum profits. And thousands dead. So it all seems pretty doom and gloom. But what can we be actually doing instead? Well, for one, you can go after ISIS where it actually hurts. Their pockets. There are many reports that Saudi Arabia is funding a lot of ISIS through the arms they have. Remember the ones that we sold them? By not selling them their arsenal, you've dealt them a huge blow. There are also many links to Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states buying from the oil rigs that ISIS now controls. These countries are quite literally bankrolling the Islamic State. And whilst we're at it, not funding and being BFFs with barbaric human rights abusing states like Saudi Arabia and China is probably for the best. It almost seems like the more atrocities a country commits, the more likely we're to cozy up to them. Despite the best efforts of the tabloid press, who pounced on the idea that a Syrian passport was found on one of the attackers, which turned out to be fake, the Paris attackers were homegrown, from France itself. An ISIS terrorist attack in the UK is much more likely to be committed by someone who's born here, rather than coming over from Syria. Perhaps instead of our government spending billions on bombing Syria, or our news printing stories rife with Islamophobia, we could spend money on fixing homegrown extremism, or just generally fixing problems that supposedly have to be cut. One commonly used Tomahawk cruise missile costs £850,000, or enough to pay the annual salary of 28 NHS nurses. The counter-terrorism budget was just raised by 3.4 billion to 15 billion, with 87 deaths in the UK from terrorism since the year 2000. Meanwhile, whilst the NHS budget is being cut, on average 155,000 people die yearly from heart disease. How the hell does this add up? As we step onto the precipice of World War III, it's vital that we as a populace understand the motives of going to war. We need to make sure that everybody is engaged, as this is one of the most important events in recent history. I mean, what else matters more than this?
Black Friday.
The Black Friday.
Black Friday.
Black Friday has hit the UK.
Fuck you! I'll be outside, mate!